Hi everyone, I'm Jesse McQuarters, editor of StatBrand Studio, and I'm joined today by Leslie Oley Wilberforce, CEO of Evidation Health. Leslie runs an organization that connects directly with people to provide multimodal, real-world data that powers scientific insights and breakthroughs. Leslie, so nice to see you again and talk with you, and thank you for joining us in this StatBrand Studio Multimedia Lounge.
Awesome. So nice to be here again and chatting with you today, too.
So Evidation connects directly with individuals over time to collect permissioned real-world health data across multiple modalities. And because that relationship is ongoing, researchers can re-engage people and ask new questions or collect additional data as research needs evolve. Can you tell me a little bit about how this model works and what makes it different from traditional approaches to real-world data?
Yeah, great question. So traditional real-world data is often collected through indirect actions and interactions with the healthcare system, through things like claims and EHR, when someone's basically seeking care within the walls of the system. The biggest thing we probably bet on early as a company is that we could really flip this model on its head and go directly to the source, which we see as the individual. Build technology that allows them to easily permission data at scale for research, get value back in the process. And so that's the big difference. Individuals, anyone over 18 in the US, can join Evidation. They can choose to share data from a number of sources, things like survey data, wearable data, electronic health record data, even increasingly biosamples in the data set. And they can share that with us for research. And what this really allows us to do that's very different from a real-world data perspective is give this very long longitudinal view of health evolving over time. So instead of just getting snapshots like you get in traditional real-world data, you have this really movie view with all the rich context of what's happening in someone's daily life in between, and to really contextualize between these episodic interactions with the healthcare system. And the last thing that you really touched on in your question, which I think is important too and really different about the model, is it lets you do something really unique. So one, in this model, because we have this ongoing connection with people over time, we're constantly generating these data sets that we have. The interesting thing, because you own the relationship with the user, you've hopefully created reasons for them to activate into research and share data over time, is that you can also create these customized data layers to answer really specific questions on top of that base data set layer. You can go back to populations, you can get more data, and really understand use case specific questions around health as they evolve as well.
Yeah, and so much of what you're talking about really relies on trust between your company and the user and people that are providing this data for greater purposes. Could you just talk a little bit about that and tell me how you engender trust in this ecosystem and really that allows you to have this kind of unique relationship with your customers?
It's such an important question, especially in the real-world data space, because if you think about it, trust is almost often forgotten in the equation. Individuals are sort of passive participants at best. Much of our healthcare data is frankly being used and we don't even know it. And so a lot of our company history and DNA has been, can we go direct to people? Can we involve them, not as a passive participant, but as an active participant? And it's interesting because it gives you both this opportunity to simultaneously create much richer data sets, but also involve people and give them agency in how their data is used, what's used, who it's shared with, and really how they can be involved in deciding how their data shapes the future of research. And I think that's been a really powerful part of our model since day zero when we founded the company. As part of that, from the user standpoint, we've tried to be very thoughtful and intentional around what value we deliver back to people. And that can come in different forms. There's extrinsic value. We actually compensate people for sharing their data. I don't know of really many or any other people who are doing that right now. People's data has value. They should share in that too. And then we've layered on intrinsic value layers. So how can we deliver insights back to folks? Because we have these very unique sort of layers of data where you can find interesting insights between different channels and signals that you might not find somewhere else. Or the one thing that we found that's really interesting is that over the years, like research in and of itself is an activator, and research in and of itself can be a sticky reason for users to want to participate. And so I'm so glad you asked the question about trust, because it's an important one I think is often missed. But I think, as we think about how to really think about data in the system differently in a much more rich way, I do think should be more at the forefront.
It's interesting what you're saying because much of healthcare data is still built around episodic interactions within the healthcare system. When somebody's in a clinic or visits the hospital. What do we miss when we rely only on those moments? And why does that matter for the AI models that are being used to understand disease, predict outcomes, and inform development decisions?
Jesse, you're absolutely right, because historically, healthcare has understood people through this series of snapshots. And now with AI, it creates this fascinating opportunity to understand health much more continuously with the tools that are available now. But it requires data that's really like matched with those tools, that's longitudinal, it's multimodal, and it's generated in the context of everyday life. And so that's really the gap that we're helping to fill. And so a simple way I usually think of it is traditional real world data often tells us what happened. If you think about it, like EHR tells us what a physician documented. Claims tell us about the money flow. But increasingly, I think the opportunity now with tools and really unique data views is to understand why it happens. And so if you think about AI emergence and how it's reshaping life sciences, what does it need? It needs context. And so if we want AI to understand how diseases progress, how people respond to treatments, or what factors like really influence outcomes in different ways, we need data that captures more of those events and more of that lived experience. Otherwise, you're sort of living in this world where you're asking models to infer relationships from sort of this incomplete picture of health. For us, a really good example of this that's maybe illustrative has actually been in the GLP-1 space. Because of some of the usage dynamics, treatment initiation patterns, like if you think about it, and we see this in our data, people are accessing new therapies in really different ways. Like this wave of consumer-driven access to therapies through telehealth, through players like Hims and Hers and Ro and Noom, and the many folks that are in the space really trying to reshape the landscape. The data simply does not exist in traditional real-world data sources. So there's almost this huge missingness problem in an area that's moving incredibly fast. And so the things that we start being able to see and measure and really filling gaps on are like, why did someone start and stop a new therapy? Like, why did they switch treatments? Fascinatingly, like what decisions are people making with no clinical support at all? Like microdosing, we've done a lot of research in that area. Most patients are getting their information from social media, not from physicians. We actually look in the data. And so that's been a really interesting use case in view where you see the need to both like fill in missingness, but also add this rich context layer to really use that to train the models of the future.
Absolutely. And it's so interesting to me that you can look longitudinally. So when you're collecting the data, you don't even know what the question is going to be in 2 years,
Yes.
or 5 years, or 10 years, but you can kind of look back and say, okay, what signal was there before a disease developed or something happened?
100%. This ability to sort of like zoom out and like rewind and fast forward time gets to the causal nature of things instead of just the like, we saw this thing happen. And I think you're like hitting the nail on the head. Like that's increasingly important, increasingly possible with AI.
All right. So we know that many diseases do not progress in a straight line, and some of the most important moments can happen between clinical visits. In conditions where this is especially true, such as autoimmune disease, how can longitudinal data from individuals help researchers really better understand variability, flare patterns, for example, in autoimmune, treatment response, and recovery?
Yeah, autoimmune disease is interesting because it illustrates a big limitation around traditional healthcare data. Because in a simple sense, these diseases are incredibly dynamic. Much of the data we have is very static. And so we're seeing this already in a cohort of individuals that we're following with autoimmune conditions like RA, Sjögren's, ankylosing AS, where we're collecting longitudinal data across validated survey data that measure things like flare burden, wearable data, electronic health record, novel omics data in those populations. And so it's fascinating. You can see in the data already that there's two patients that may have very similar EHR, annotations and recordings, but very different patterns of flare, remission, treatment response, and things that are happening in between those visits. And so I think if you tie this to sort of the future of what's needed and where real world data is going, the future is not just bigger data sets. It's data sets that can really help connect things like disease dynamics to underlying and causal biology, which sort of in drug discovery has been this like holy grail that's really, really hard to crack. And so we're already seeing some really interesting things that collecting biosample data in these populations for proteomics testing at baseline and flare states gives you this like fascinating and very dynamic picture of like how proteins are folding over time, and really allows you to start interrogating some of the biological mechanisms associated with these changes. And so I think that's some of the really important like scientific breakthroughs when you start matching dynamic data sets with dynamic disease conditions. I think an important notable point, because Jesse, you've kind of gone back to the patient view on this a lot of times, is that notably for patients with autoimmune conditions, it's an area that is plagued by a very long path to diagnosis often. And so you think about what we're collecting for patients and participants, we also create a much more structured system of record for symptoms and flare burden and what's actually happening. And what you see is for many patients, like the diagnosis, like what's registered in the EHR isn't really like the beginning of the disease, even though that's the first time it's like registered under a diagnosis code. There's all this like preceding data that happens before then. And how can we use that to help people in their real lives also get diagnosed earlier, also bring a more complete picture of like how their health is unfolding in an N of 1 case into clinical interactions.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. I think of conditions like lupus, where
Yes.
there's just not even like a definitive clinical definition necessarily. Like
Yes.
it's really different from person to person. Amazing that you can capture that. Can you take it?
I was going to say, I think there's many of these like conditions that appear very heterogeneous, or sorry, really homogeneous. They're treated very homogeneously over time. But I actually think that a lot of what will happen in the next number of years of research is that we'll find that there's actually like separate sort of physiology and biology happening in different patients. And my hope is that, if you can research and understand that first, that can really help also tailor how treatment happens in the future as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, I see that parallel with cancer treatment diagnosis,
Yes.
where
Yeah.
where it's just becoming this precision approach, really understanding individual data,
Yes.
and being able to respond to that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So briefly, what have been some of your successes? You've been talking a lot about this work and the things that you've been doing. Where has that really panned out for Evidation?
Yeah, I mean, there's some great areas where we've seen a lot of promise and a lot of impact in the work that we've done. So some areas that I think are really exciting to highlight, like one is I talked about the GLP-1 space. I think that there's tremendous opportunity there to really understand patient journeys, to understand like how quickly that market is evolving and sort of who has the crystal ball on being able to predict what's going to happen next quarter, next year, because the space is moving so fast, because patients are now, really playing a much greater role in choice, frankly. And so I think I mentioned that before, but has been a great use case where we're able to respond really quickly to trends, to what's happening. Right now there's a lot of talk around discontinuation and restarts and why people are discontinuing. Like we're able to see really fascinating trends there. Another area is as pill-based therapies are coming out, how does that change treatment initiation? How does that change switching between injectables and that? So that's been a really interesting area. We've done a lot of research historically. We have a suite of machine learning models historically. Now they're AI models and foundation models that we have that we tune for different conditions. But in things like flu and COVID has been an area where we've done a lot of research. And you can have fascinating impact if you can help people understand early onset of one of those, flu or COVID. And that can be, enroll in a clinical trial that's super hard to enroll because by the time someone shows up 3 days into an episode for a clinical trial on a household spread of flu therapy, it's way too late. Or you can find people with background risk factors that you should say, hey, you actually might want to talk to your doctor sooner about antibody therapy, something like that. So that's been a really exciting area where you're pairing this AI model and closed loop relationship with people to drive impact at an individual and system level simultaneously. Other areas that we're really excited about are like migraine and neurology. We have a large cohort of 30,000 users that experience headaches and migraines. And, one of the greatest areas of impact is like measuring migraine burden in those folks over time and finding people who, for example, might be on a first line therapy with high migraine burden and just need educated that there's a second line therapy available. And so being able to see those patient trajectories and journeys at scale has been really impactful to really shape commercial strategies as well.
Yeah, I really think if we're going to solve some of the issues that are occurring in medicine, moving to this preventative model rather than being reactive, I think is huge. And I love that you guys are doing that work.
And I think as the sort of commercial landscape changes around a lot of therapies, to the point you made, like precision medicine, precision therapies, it's going to require that we reach patients in really different ways. I think that the era of just like blasting out a Super Bowl commercial probably still has some, some relevance and a really broad reach. But I think there's tremendous opportunity in really being able to find individuals who are most appropriate at very important moments in time becomes increasingly important as well.
And Leslie, as life sciences companies and companies building AI models think about the next generation of real-world data, what are some of the important data attributes to consider beyond scale?
Yeah. So the next generation of real-world data, in my opinion, won't just be about scale alone. It's going to depend on things like longitudinal depth, multimodal richness, importantly, representativeness, and this ability to really generate new evidence over time. And I think people that will win in that space are able to crack this notion of building this living layer of rich, continuously evolving human data. So that data set evolves, frankly, as human biology at scale evolves. And in a really simple way, the models are only as good and inclusive as the data that they've been trained on. So I think that's a big call to action for all of us in the industry to really think about how we set ourselves up for this future. I think AI-driven discovery is a great area for opportunity. And it's been really interesting over the past number of months to see research scientists really hungry to not just get access to genetic data or assay outputs or biosamples, but how can we now, with new AI tools, pair that with length of clinical data, phenotypic data, outcomes data, all of these things that really add context around the sample and hopefully increase the rate of successful new target identification that ultimately makes it to patients. Two other things that I think are often forgotten in the equation, but I think will be important going forward. One is the ability to re-engage patients. I think in a way that keeps patients really at the center of things and in control of their data, but it also allows you to create this living system as new hypotheses emerge, research can validate new findings, collect additional data. And the last one that I think is often forgotten in the equation is building trust. As I mentioned before, often individuals are sort of passively participating at best in many of the data sets, but I think there's really this unique opportunity to allow people to own their own data in the process, choose how it's used, where it's shared, and really be much more active voice and active participants in how their data can shape the future of research.
Leslie Oley, Wilberforce, CEO of Evidation Health, thank you so much for sharing this work that your company is doing and a little bit about this community that you're building.
Jesse, thanks for the great conversation. Thanks for having me.